All right. Whoa. My students know I'm loud enough without that. So thank all of you for coming to the Ronald L. Heinemann Lecture in the History of the American South. Tonight's lecture is hosted by the History Department here at Hampden-Sydney College, and this is the fourth installment of the lecture series now that, as some of you know, rotates between topics in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. I'm sure you're all relieved that we are back in the 19th century, where we belong, especially Dr. Coos. Just to give you a little bit of backstory on the man from whom the lecture series is named, Dr. Ron Heinemann arrived in Hampden-Sydney in 1968. And if you were here 4 years ago, I used the same little tidbit, but I like it, so I'm going to say it again. To put that in perspective, Dr. Heinemann set foot on this campus before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. He was still here when I got here in 2018. Over the course of more than 5 decades at the college, he helped thousands, literally thousands, of students grapple with some of the most controversial and traumatic moments of the American experience, from the slave debate to the shattering of the Union to the Civil Rights Movement to the war in Vietnam. He was twice voted the most distinguished professor by graduating seniors and was a recipient of both the William Cabell Award and the J.B. Fugel Award, each for excellence in teaching. Alongside his work in the classroom, Dr. Heinemann published a well-respected history of the Great Depression and the New Deal in Virginia. He authored a landmark biography of Harry Byrd, and he was a 2-time recipient of the John Peter Mettow Award for Excellence in Research, among numerous other academic honors. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Caroline Janney, the John L. Now III Professor of American History, or I should say of the American Civil War at UVA, is also a highly decorated author and historian. We are very lucky to have her, and even luckier that she just had to come right down the road. She is the author of Burying the Dead But Not the Past, Ladies' Memorial Associations and the Lost Cause, published by UNC in 2008. Remembering the Civil War, Reunion, and the Limits of Reconciliation, published by UNC in 2013, which won the Charles Sender Award from the Southern Historical Association and the Jefferson Davis Award from the American Civil War Museum. And her most recent book, Ends of War, The Unfinished Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox, UNC 2021. And this is the book that her lecture is based on. It claimed the biggie. That one won the 2022 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, which is the gold standard for books in Civil War history. Now, for many fans of Civil War history, our mental imagery of the conflict begins with the bombardment at Fort Sumter, and it stops somewhat abruptly with Grant and Lee sitting in Wilmer McLean's cramped parlor at Appomattox. But this evening, Dr. Janney is going to change that with a talk about what actually happens to Lee's men after they surrender, as the Army goes through the process of dissolving. So with that, I will get out of the way, and then I will pass the podium to Dr. Jude.
Thank you, Matt, for that very kind introduction. Can you all hear me well? I usually tell my own students I have 2 younger brothers and a son, so I do know how to raise my voice if need be. Thank you all for having me this evening. It's such a delight to come down the road. I've had a wonderful evening thus far, and I'm looking forward to sharing a bit with you about a world that is very close to you. Appomattox, of course, just down the road from you. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with McLean's Parlor, with Appomattox Courthouse as the place where Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant and the U.S. government on April 9th, 1865. Indeed, we are quickly approaching the 160th anniversary in just a week. Since that time, Appomattox has become shorthand. I know I certainly still in my class use Appomattox to refer to the end of the war. But tonight, I'd like to flip that narrative. I'd like you to think of Appomattox as the beginning of the story, or as the starting point of many stories rather than the ending point. Indeed, there are as many stories that begin at Appomattox as there were men that were there. But it's not just their stories that are part of this unfolding that happens in the days and weeks and months after April 9th. It's also the story of those they encountered as the men marched away from Appomattox. But before we get into their stories, there are two key things I would like you to remember. First, and maybe most important, the terms that were agreed upon, the surrender terms, were just that. They were not a peace treaty. Peace treaties had to be signed by political leaders, not military leaders. Indeed, Grant had explicit instructions from President Lincoln that he was not to negotiate on political topics. Indeed, the war would never witness a peace treaty because that would compromise, that would undermine the United States' insistence that this was indeed a rebellion. The terms that were signed were the terms of surrender of a single army. So Appomattox was not the legal end of the war. It was only the capitulation of one army, the most important Confederate army, but only one army. The second thing I would like you to keep in mind is that Grant's terms sent Lee's soldiers back to their homes as paroled prisoners of war. So rather than sending them to prisoner of war camps, which was certainly an option, they are paroled and sent home. For Grant, getting Lee's soldiers home as quickly as possible was key to restoring the reunion, and it was as practical as it was pragmatic. As such, on the morning of April 10th, so the day after the formal surrender, Grant would meet with Lee one more time, and one of the things that they would agree upon was a series of orders, or a special order that Grant would issue that stated, and I'm going to read this to you because the language is very important. All officers and men of the Confederate service paroled at Appomattox Courthouse, who to reach their homes are compelled to pass through the lines of the Union armies, will be allowed to do so, to pass free on all government transports and military railroads. Well, in order to do that, you had to have a pass. You might be familiar with some of these parole passes. I understand some of you visited Appomattox recently. You went to Clover Hill Tavern, where they still have the reproduction of printing these passes. If you ever come across these, there are 3 different designs that you'll find on the left-hand side, all of these indicating that they were printed there on the field by one of the Corps commanders, happened to have a printing press with him. These passes, and this is sometimes people call these the paroles. That's kind of conflating terms. This is a parole pass. And this parole pass, you can see on this one, has been stamped because you could use this pass, thanks to Grant's orders on the morning of the 10th, to go to the nearest U.S. Provost Marshal. And if they had extra rations, you could show this pass, prove that you had indeed been surrendered, that you were a paroled prisoner of war. So you could use it to get rations. You could also use it to take the train. If they're government-run trains, you could use it to take a steamer. So these are all ways that aren't just examples of Grant being magnanimous, but of him trying to get soldiers home as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Part of that is to avoid a protracted guerrilla war. And we don't talk about this very often because it didn't happen. At least it doesn't happen in the East. I'm going to give a nod over here. We can talk about what happens in the West, but Grant and Sherman have a real fear that guerrilla warfare could follow. And so part of this is get men home, get them paroled as quickly as possible and get them home. All of this to say that disbanding Lee's army marked the first and most important step in an enormous process of demobilizing the armies of the Confederacy, a process that was in many ways as important as mobilizing the men had been in 1861. It involved tens of thousands of men across a vast landscape, and it proved far more drawn out at the time than people considered it would be at the time, and certainly that people have understood since. It involved the stories of civilians, black and white, free and enslaved, all of whom were entangled with Lee's dispersing army. And more than anything, this process of disbanding the Confederate armies underscored the uncertainty and the unforeseen consequences of disbanding a rebel army during a civil war. And one of the things that I didn't go into this project considering, because I had written 2 books about Civil War memory, so I wasn't going to write another book about Civil War memory. But the more I studied and read these accounts of Lee's men as they go home, I realized that the kernel of the lost cause was right there. That the process of disbanding the Confederate armies, in fact, helps explain how and why the lost cause took hold so quickly. So this evening, what I'd like to do is offer you a glimpse of some of the stories of many of the men going home. And I'm going to highlight one story in particular. We could talk about any number of men. I've chose someone who is from far away, so choosing someone from Mississippi. We don't have a picture of him, but he's number 37, if you can make it out on this list. A Confederate soldier from Mississippi, Private Ransom J. Lightsey of the 16th Mississippi. Lightsey was 23 years old in 1861, living in Jasper County, Mississippi, when he decided to enlist in the war, formally joining Company F of the 16th Mississippi on May 31st, 1861 at Corinth. His regiment was then sent here to Virginia, where it fought under Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns of '62. Then at 7 Days, 2nd Manassas, and Antietam. Lightsey was wounded in the fighting in Fredericksburg in December of 1862, but he would finally rejoin his regiment and fight in the 1864 Overland Campaign in and around the trenches at Petersburg. And from then, he would stay with the Army of Northern Virginia as it made its way west. I'll do another little pet peeve. Lee certainly didn't think of it as his retreat at the moment. He was trying to get to the closest railroad line that would take him south to join up with Joe Johnston's army in North Carolina. But Lightsey is with them. Lightsey is on that constant march as it pushes ever west, trying to keep up with the army. And he surrenders at Appomattox with the rest of Lee's army. What does leaving Appomattox look like? Well, for many of Lee's men, the journey began home even before April 9th, 1865, because somewhere between 16 and 20,000 of Lee's men dropped out of the ranks before they ever reached Appomattox Courthouse. I'll come back and talk more about them in a moment. But for the vast majority of Lee's men, and the infantry in particular, about 28,000 men, there would be a formal surrender ceremony on April 12th. That marked the beginning of their journeys home. For example, the next morning, April 13th, Captain William Henry Harder and his regiment of the 23rd Tennessee marched out. It was working. Oh, there we go. There he went. There's Captain Harder. Marched out of Appomattox, bound for their homes in Tennessee. Leaving by way of the Lynchburg Road, he and the 63 remaining members of the 23rd marched alongside a group of nearly 1,000 other Confederate soldiers bound for Southwest Virginia and Tennessee. Later that evening, Harder observed that the Confederates were now, quote, free to go where we liked. But they didn't. The men had not broken from the ranks. Instead, on they marched, four abreast, brigade following brigade, regiment after regiment. And I think this stands in stark contrast to the images that we may have for the handful of you in the room that may have seen Gone with the Wind. I was talking to my students about this morning. None of them have seen it. But the notion of Ashley wandering home, of one or two soldiers wandering home, that did happen. But we also have entire regiments and brigades that are marching away from Appomattox in many ways just as they had arrived at Appomattox. And so if you were in the countryside not far from here, you might have imagined that the war was indeed still going on because you still see the passing of armies. Now, there certainly were those who left in small groups, in pairs or small parties. That was the case for Lightsey. He left with 3 other members of Company F of the 16th Mississippi. Most, like Lightsey, initially left Appomattox by foot, unless they were lucky enough to come across an abandoned horse or mule. We'll come back to a story of a man who did that. The great majority of them started south to the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, and so on. Some kept to the roads, but others tried to avoid Union troops. So they took to the muddy ravines, to the hog paths, to the stream beds, keeping off the beaten path. Some headed east toward Burkeville, Burkeville Station, deliberately seeking out those Union posts. Now remember, you have to have a parole pass in order to get provisions from the Union Provost Marshal. And so why they're heading to Burkeville is because this is the closest railhead where the railroads are actually running. They head there, but along the way, many of them will stop here in Farmville. Remember those 16 to 20,000 men who had not been paroled at Appomattox? Well, many of them are, one of the things that Grant does is he allows them to be paroled wherever they may be, so long as they turn themselves in to the Union Provost Marshal. And so here in Farmville, some 1,842 men will be paroled between April 11th and April 21st. So coming here, seeking those parole passes, those passes look physically different than the ones printed at Appomattox. But you can see here on this image, I collected data of, I went through reams of records at the National Archives, finding these parole lists for places beyond Appomattox. I created a database that came up with about 18,000 individual names of men who should have been here at Appomattox. Their units were here, they should have been with their regiments, and they weren't. But as you can see, paroling happens all over the state of Virginia. It happens into West Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. All of this is part of the process that Grant is trying to get soldiers paroled. A paroled soldier is more trustworthy in his mind than an unparoled soldier. And also the penalty for breaking one's parole is execution or at the very minimum, imprisonment. So some are heading toward Burkeville to catch that rail junction. Vast majority, many are heading west, heading across the Blue Ridge to Big Lick, now known as Roanoke, to begin their trek southward. There it is. I can't even see I should just quit messing with this. Many of them head south to Danville. Everybody knows where Danville is now, right? They're heading south to Danville because this is the closest railroad connection that is going to take men south. They're trying to get to Danville and then across to Greensboro and beyond, taking railroad cars as far as they can. So throughout the Carolinas and into Georgia and beyond, they clambered onto railroad cars. They clambered on top of railroad cars. Many of them, some of them forced to ride on the top, many of them riding for a few miles, and then they'll come to a break in the railroad line and they'll have to walk for a bit. Lightsey and his three companions, this is his route that he takes. They did not board a train until they reached Selma, Alabama. So they walked that entire way. Indeed, Lightsey's travel home included nearly every form of available transportation. He walked to Alabama, by which point he was barefoot. He crossed rivers by canoe. Portions of the trip were by train, and other legs by steamboat. So this is not just the story of men hoofing it home, if you will. Indeed, a significant number of men, here we go, are taking steamboats. They are going to places like Fortress Monroe and City Point, and they're boarding steamboats that will take them to places like Savannah, that will take them to New Orleans, to Galveston and beyond. I'm really much better at this, I promise, than this clicker is making me look. Okay, so transportation. Finding transportation can be difficult. If that's the case, finding food is almost as challenging as securing transportation. Some of them turned to what remained of the Confederate government. Even though Confederate armies had been hard-pressed to secure enough provisions for its armies, by mid-April, there were still significant stores of government provisions, warehouses throughout the South, especially still in Virginia, that had provisions meant for the army. Indeed, only a day's march south of Appomattox, Major General Brian Grimes of North Carolina and what remained of his division came upon a small country store where nearly 100 paroled men and several local women had gathered. The shop had served as the distribution center. Now it's getting to be comical. The distribution center for needy soldiers' wives to attain rations. And the women had arrived that morning to collect their small allotment of meat. The paroled men insisted that they would indeed leave the meat for the women, but they demanded that the store owner turn over his stores of cowpeas to them. Well, when the shop owner refused, General Grimes, who is still carrying his sidearm because officers were allowed to keep those, still wearing the uniform of a general and still commanding the remnants of his division, however tenuously, he insisted that he maintained power to impress goods from government warehouses and from civilians, especially those that were bound for the Confederate government to begin with. When he pulls out his sidearm, the store owner finally relents, prompting a scramble among the soldiers. The stories suggest that they're shoving peas into anything that they can find, into their haversacks, into their pockets. They're emptying containers in the store, looking for anything to carry away these cowpeas. One ingenious young soldier decided to pull off his pants, make them into a sack by tying the legs together, and he filled them with cowpeas. An amused comrade wrote, "Off he marched with the peas in the forked sack around his neck." So we can imagine these stories, these trials. There's another account of some men that literally eat crow because that's all they can find. Keeping in mind that the enlisted men don't have their rifles anymore, so hunting is a challenge. Officers would have had their sidearms, but finding provisions is incredibly difficult. With tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers traversing the countryside, it's civilians who bear the brunt of providing sustenance. This is something that Lightsey and his companions discovered very quickly. They realized that the men who left Appomattox, those that had left first, were able to clear out and take whatever provisions they came upon. So this is Lightsey's diary. "We moved out by the right flank for several miles until we passed beyond the line that the paroled army was traveling. Then we came to a house where there was plenty of grub. The old gentleman of the house gave us all we wanted to eat." But this civilian proved to have even more valuable information. This is Lightsey again. "He provided a diagram of a route that would lead us through a country where provisions were plentiful. The people living on this route were nearly all loyal Confederates." So this man draws a map, shows Lightsey and his companions where they can reliably find food. Now, not all civilians were so willing to share what they had. As Lee's soldiers dispersed across the countryside, they encountered both devoted Unionists and Confederates who had grown weary of impressment agents and decided that they were no longer willing to give anything, food, shelter, anything, to Confederates. One of the really fascinating things that I found were lists in men's diaries, the paroled men that are going home, lists of civilians who were willing to share food with them or provide lodging, even if that meant a corn crib, and those who would not. So keeping a tally of who is willing to aid them and who's not. Lightsey noted that as they crossed the Dan River into North Carolina, they began to encounter more and more Unionists, including an old man who informed them, quote, "He was very glad that the Yankees had whipped us." Now, this man eventually grudgingly supplies some food, but many others refuse to do so. Indeed, when Captain Harder and his group of Tennessee soldiers march into East Tennessee, which was very much a Unionist stronghold, they encounter a great deal of resistance. And again, weapons are drawn. Some of the officers are trying to protect their soldiers because, again, they're going home, but they're going into places that certainly don't support the Confederate war effort. Near Washington, Georgia, Lightsey and his companions finally found a U.S. post that had provisions so they could show their parole pass and get provisions. Again, this is from his diary. He says they pull out their paroles and receive rations. "We would have fared pretty badly in this country if we had been without those provisions." So they make it as far as Georgia, and at this point now they have to rely on the U.S. government, something that many Confederates had simply refused to do up to this point. Yet even in regions sympathetic to the Confederacy, the refusal or the inability of civilians to provide food led some soldiers to resort to violence and even plundering, just as Union and Confederate authorities had worried. Georgian Lieutenant David Champion and his traveling companions became outraged when an older man in the Carolinas refused to accept Confederate money for corn and bacon. I mean, who can blame this man for refusing to accept it? But this is what Champion has to say in his diary. Seeing it was useless to try to trade with him, I ordered the boys to go to his corn crib and smokehouse and get the corn and bacon we needed. We carried the corn to a mill nearby on the creek and ground it and borrowed his wash pot to cook the meat in. Countless stories of this nature of men just taking what they believed was theirs. In several instances, Lee's soldiers turned to looting and pillaging at Danville, at Greensboro, at Charlotte. And on May 1st, there we go, in Augusta, Georgia, they began looting government stores and pillaging a locally owned tobacco shop. Yet the city paper tried to rationalize their actions, using the same logic as Confederate officers, such as General Grimes, that believed that the Confederate government owed their men something, that they owed them goods or compensation for their services. The local newspaper said that mobs of Confederate soldiers raiding government warehouses could be explained, if not condoned. Now, looting of private stores, they said, was off limits. But they said, these men fought for us. They were there to the end. Therefore, we don't agree with what they're doing, but we certainly understand why they are resorting to what they are resorting to. Of course, they shouldn't engage in looting and plundering. But many Confederate sympathizers believed it could be forgiven as part of the social contract that implied that soldiers, especially those who had remained loyal to the end, were at least entitled to be fed. Now, I'd like to turn now to a different story, another story, to highlight the uncertainty that followed the surrender at Appomattox. And here we will turn to a Virginia soldier. Thomas Murray, we don't have a picture of him, but he was from Fairfax County, from Fairfax Courthouse. He was born in 1843. And when the war began, he was an 18-year-old student attending Georgetown in D.C. That summer, he enlisted in the 17th Virginia. He would eventually be part of Pickett's division. And he served with the 17th Virginia until 1864, when he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 1st Battalion of the Virginia Infantry. He made it to Appomattox, where he received his parole. And there he went and sought out some of his former comrades, men from the 17th Virginia, to try to make their way home back to Fairfax. He is one of those men who is fortunate enough to find a dilapidated, broken down, old horse that is going to help in part on their trip home. So they're traveling from Appomattox toward Fairfax. They have this horse that they're going to take turns riding. It is skin and bones. I don't know how it's managing to carry anyone, but they're taking turns riding it. They're also traversing muddy roads. The spring of 65 had been especially rainy. A lot of the rivers and creeks are swollen. They are searching for places to stay. They camp in bushes along the roadside when they can't find any homes. But only a day's ride from home, Tom's fortunes were about to turn worse. When they reached the outskirts of Warrenton in Fauquier County, they learned of Lincoln's assassination. And they learned, or they were told, that the federal troops were quite angry. This is John Mosby's territory, and at this point, Mosby is refusing to surrender. The manhunt for Lincoln's assassins is underway. And they've been warned that maybe they shouldn't try to go back toward Union lines around Fairfax Courthouse. But Murray has managed to get word somehow through the lines that his father has just died, and he wants to make it home. More important, he feels certain that that parole pass that he carries from Appomattox is protection. As long as he shows this parole pass, he believes, he can get through the Union lines. That's precisely what Grant had said on the morning of April 10th, and he should be able to get home to his mother. But it doesn't turn out that way. Instead, Murray is immediately detained after trying to get past the provost guard. And the pictures aren't that important. yet I really do want them to cooperate. They take him to the provost marshal's office. He pleads that his father has just died. He begs to go home. Two sympathetic members of the provost guard relent, but they remind him that he is a paroled prisoner of war. So they're going to allow him to go home for a single evening, see his mother, but they will be waiting for him the next day. And this is precisely what happens. He spends the evening with his grieving mother. The next morning, the two soldiers are there waiting outside the home. They gather him up, take him along the bumpy ride along the corduroy road to Fairfax Station, where they put him on a train and they take him to be detained in Alexandria. I don't know. I'm almost at the end of these images. There's only one more image that really matters, and if it doesn't work, then we'll get past that. Okay. He still has his parole pass. He gets there, and he realizes that he's being held in a prison. Now, before he is detained, he goes again before another provost marshal. They record his name, and they take that parole pass from Appomattox, and they tear it in half. No longer does he have proof that he is, in fact, a paroled soldier. From there, he's marched into this large, empty room, confined alongside some 200 to 300 other Confederates. Looks around the room, and he starts to realize that these are other men that he knows. These are other members of the 17th Virginia, other men that are from Fairfax, that are from Alexandria, local men who are likewise trying to return home. And as his eyes adjust to the darkness, he starts to realize exactly where they've been taken. This is a military prison in the former Bryce, Birch and Company slave jail on Duke Street, one of the largest and most notorious slave markets in the country. Now, Murray was the son of a Fairfax attorney who owned 7 slaves in 1860, and Murray and his fellow Confederates could not have escaped the irony. Men who had gone off to war to protect their slave-holding nation now found themselves confined in the very same pens from which they had traded human flesh. Indeed, there is evidence that suggests that Murray's father had purchased enslaved people from this very jail. All of this is a reminder that they are prisoners of war, that it's not certain whether they will have their rights as they believe they are entitled to restored to them. What is the future going to look like? We can't stop the story in McLean's parlor if we want to understand what this was really playing out in real time. From there, commissioned officers are directed to arrange themselves on a line, and a U.S. sergeant stepped forward with a pair of scissors, cut the buttons off the men's jackets, off their uniforms, cut off any insignia, stripped them of their rank, of any proof that they had remained with Lee's army until the bitter end, and Murray and his comrades were then released to their homes under guard. They remained prisoners of war. Their names were printed in the local newspaper. It's like it works every other time. If you want to switch it out, you can. There we go. There's one, but we'll try to. It is. It's just messing with me. The Alexandria Gazette is the newspaper in Alexandria, and for weeks after the surrendered Appomattox, names of Confederate soldiers who have returned to the city of Alexandria, their names are printed in the local newspaper. Okay, let's see if this works. Yes, look at that. Thank you, Matt. Murray and some 75,000 other Confederates who claimed homes and loyal territories, both in Union portions of Virginia, so Alexandria, Hampton Roads, or in the loyal border states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia, they encounter a whole batch of new anxieties and questions. Indeed, both in Maryland and in West Virginia, these are counties I found where vigilance committees were established. You can hear some of the Revolutionary War rhetoric here. These committees are established to keep out rebels, to prevent them from returning home. This happens in West Virginia as well. Men are tarred and feathered. There is a shootout that happens in Barber County, West Virginia, when 2 Confederate brothers come home. In other words, the war has not ended, and Even more so, both Grant and Attorney General Speed will issue orders saying that paroled Confederates from the states who never passed ordinances of secession, so it doesn't include West Virginia because that was part of Virginia, but Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, that Confederates have no homes in those states, that they are forbidden from going home to these states. All of this begged the question, should Confederates be allowed to return to communities that considered their actions treasonous? Were paroled Confederates citizens with rights? Would they have to take an oath of allegiance to return home? If they refused, what would happen to them? The degree to which Grant's terms from April 9th would serve to ease defeated Confederates back into civilian life and to protect them from charges of treason were still very much up in the air. Again, this story does not end at Appomattox Courthouse. That was true for African Americans as well. Confederates moving across the South in the days and weeks after Appomattox witnessed a world far removed from that which they had left to defend in 1861. So did African Americans. One former enslaved man from Alabama recalled watching Confederates leave for war laughing and gay. They had departed for war singing Dixie, he said, certain they were going to win. But now they returned skin and bones, their eyes hollow, their clothes ragged. In occupied South Carolina, members of the 54th Massachusetts took notice as well. Here's from a soldier of the 54th Massachusetts. From the paroled armies of the defunct Confederacy came large numbers of soldiers in dilapidated garments and emaciated physical condition. Their destitution was so great, he noted, they were glad to share the rations of our colored soldiers. Now, at least some enslaved men had been attached to Lee's army. Indeed, the record indicates that there were hundreds of Black men that were still with Lee's army at Appomattox. Some of them decided to travel home with their former masters. Edwin Bogan of North Carolina was one such man who traveled home with his former enslaver and to get to his wife and son. So these are decisions, too, that the men that are attached to Lee's army, the body servants in Lee's army, have to decide. Do they strike out on their own? And if they do, what will be the consequences? Or do they go home with people who they believe might protect them? Nowhere was the new order more apparent than in Confederate soldiers' encounters with United States colored troops. Indeed, on April 26th, 1865, the Wilmington steamed into the Savannah port with 690 paroled Confederates, including David L. Gear and other members of Finnegan's Florida Brigade. By the time they reached Savannah, they claimed they had already killed 2 Black soldiers. In Georgia, their deadly retaliation continued. While awaiting a ship that would take them to Jacksonville, a Black sentinel had reportedly stomped out the Floridians' campfire. And enraged, they plotted his execution. Using a surgeon's knife, they slashed his throat and they tossed him and all evidence of the crime in the river. When white officers grew suspicious about the missing sentinel, Gear and 63 other Florida soldiers decided that they would hightail it across the country rather than try to board one of these steamers and be caught. In other words, for the 3rd time since leaving Appomattox, they claimed at least to have killed Black soldiers and gotten away with it. Other interactions with Black soldiers proved less deadly, but no less revealing of how much the social order had changed. At Selma, Alabama, U.S. officers ordered members of Hood's Texas Brigade to disembark from a train so a USCT regiment might travel instead. And several days later, in New Orleans, the Texans found themselves guarded by a USCT company, a slight that Captain W.T. Hill of the 5th Texas believed to be intentionally demeaning. More humiliating for Confederates, the Black soldiers had taken to cutting off the rebels' buttons. Hill has this to say. He says, the Texans were quick to catch on, and by cutting off their brass buttons themselves, denied them the great satisfaction of doing so. Indeed, in the wake of surrender, Black soldiers guarding paroled Confederates, cutting buttons off rebel coats, taking precedence in travel, embodied the world turned upside down. The presence of black men in uniforms, perhaps more than the surrender itself, represented the death of the Confederacy and a new racial order. There are so many more stories that we could tell of each of these individual men, but I'd like to leave you with this. Rather than serving as a clear ending to the war, the surrender at Appomattox and the trek home of Lee's army brought into stark relief many of the legal, the social, the political questions that had plagued the war from the very beginning. Perhaps most important, there had never been a golden moment when Lee's soldiers or their civilian supporters had been so thoroughly subjugated that they were willing to accept any conditions. For Confederate soldiers and their civilian supporters, surrendering to U.S. forces did not mean admitting that their cause was wrong. As the Shenandoah Valley newspaper reassured its readers on April 21st, quote, "Generally surrendered, not rights of conscience, no sentiment or feeling or affection for his country. Indeed, we are still proud of our country, I, if possible, prouder than ever, and still love it with a devotion intensified by her misfortune. There is the lost cause in a nutshell." If anything, the humiliation of registering at provost marshal's offices, of being detained by Union troops, of having your buttons and insignia cut off, the presence of black and white occupying troops, indeed the very trip home itself, emboldened the claims of Confederate soldiers of their Southern righteousness and of Northern barbarity. Indeed, the disbanding of Lee's army had not marked the end of the nation's division, as we are so often taught and so often led to believe in this myth of Appomattox. Instead, it was only the beginning, foreshadowing much of what would play out not only in the days and weeks to come, but in the decades, and one might even say in the century to come. Thank you. Sorry about the technical glitches. I will fall back on, I spend most of my time in the 19th century, so I'm not as tech savvy as maybe I should be. Any questions? Yes.
Was Lee's army disbanded? How big was it?
So when I'm going to back up here and do some very rough math. When he abandons the trenches and the works at Petersburg and Richmond, the night of April 2nd, together in those forces, he has about 60,000 men. On the retreat to Appomattox, on the fight, the push west, somewhere around 11,000 casualties occur, most of those prisoners of war. At Appomattox, there are roughly 28,000 men who formally surrendered. 28,231 is the formal number, which means that there are about 20,000 men that are unaccounted for that fell out of the ranks along the way. For a long time, it was the number that Lee gave on the morning of April 9th was that he had somewhere around 12 to 15,000. And for a long time, people thought that was a product of the lost cause. I actually think he was probably closer to the truth, because many, many men come back to the ranks once they hear that the surrender has happened. Now, there are at least 2,000, if not more, cavalry who managed to make it past the Union cordon and make it to Lynchburg, many of whom will disband, go home, wait to be called to action again, which Tom Rosser will do on April 12th, the same day that the infantry is having its formal parade. But 60,000 on April 2nd, 28,000 formally surrender at Appomattox. Yes.
So did Lee ever find out about some of the more violent actions these Confederates were engaging in, and did he ever speak on it?
I don't know if he ever found out about it, and he certainly never wrote about it. The one thing that he did get involved in, so Tom Murray is just one example of soldiers that are being detained as they make their way back through Union lines. There are numerous soldiers that are detained at Fort Monroe, so Hampton Roads today. If you go across the bridge tunnel, look to your left if you're heading towards the beach. Fort Monroe is right there. Many of them are being detained there. They believe that they're, especially soldiers from Kentucky and Tennessee, and they say that they are on their speediest and quickest route home because they want to take steamers, go up the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore, and then take the B&O across, and then come down into Kentucky and eventually Tennessee that way. They make their case. They're still being detained by late April. And so somehow they get a letter to Lee, who's in Richmond by this point, and Lee writes to Grant. And Grant does intervene and has them released, and then tells the Union officers at Fort Monroe, don't detain anymore. This is getting to be a problem. So that's the extent to which Lee is involved in these at least public conversations about what this trip home means, and to what extent the parole pass is meant to protect his soldiers. That's part of the language that he uses in his letter to Grant, saying, nowhere did you say that my men would be detained, and increasingly they're detained for wearing their Confederate uniform. It's the other thing that's happening. Yes.
So the soldiers that were dispersed that have consulted LG, were there any groups, because they were small and danger off, were there any groups that established themselves as opposed?
Great question. Not officially, but there are, and that's so hard. I shouldn't give such a blanket answer. What does happen is, especially in the Shenandoah Valley, there are lots of reports of marauders and people that were already acting in that fashion that were not necessarily Lee soldiers. But it is amping up suspicion about all of these groups. The Valley newspapers are filled with reports of men coming out of the hollows and out of the mountains that weren't attached to Lee's army, or at least hadn't been in recent months. But I haven't come across any evidence, not to say that it doesn't exist, that these groups did such a thing. But again, most of them are sincerely trying to make their way home. Those marauding groups, so to speak, were already doing what they were doing in many instances.
Don't blame me for asking about guerrillas, because he was starving it. I have two questions. One is hypothetical.
Okay.
The first one with guerrillas, you mentioned that part of the reason Grant wanted the most efficient means possible of dispersing these men is so you didn't have large cohorts that could potentially resort to this. Do you feel like Lee's men at this stage in the war have a real sense of what it would have actually involved to carry on a prolonged insurgency, or is this an unfounded fear on Grant's part?
So to the first part of the question, I don't think they have a real sense. There are those who want to continue the fight, and I write a good bit about these men, but they want to do so as a regular army. They're trying to make their way, for the most part, to Johnston, and many of them make their way to Johnston, and he asks where they were on April 9th, and when they tell him, he says, you're included in the parole. And so those men none of the men that I follow that are trying to continue the war are talking about doing it in a guerrilla style. They're talking about organized regular army. They're talking about cavalry in the valley. This is Lunford Lomax. This is Tom Rosser. This is Tom Munford that are doing this. They're not talking about guerrilla warfare. But to the second part of your question, I don't think Grant's fears were unfounded because of his experience in the West, because of his early wartime experience, because it's Grant and Sherman that are writing these things. Sherman writes a letter to his wife, Ellen. It is either on April 9th or April 10th, as everything is unfolding at Appomattox. And he says, I fear that if we don't compel the armies to surrender, we're going to end up with guerrilla warfare everywhere. It's on their minds, but I think there's a reason it's on their minds. And I do think that the Lincoln assassination exasperates those fears and makes them see, the spectacle of that type of violence everywhere.
So that leads into my hypothetical, which isn't fair, but I'm going to ask anyway. If this somehow gets drawn out another 5 days, and Lincoln dies before they sit down in his parlor, how do you imagine the terms of this or the disbursement change, or does it? I mean, do they still have the same logistical issues that have to be dealt with?
Well, we can look at what happens with Johnston's army. to some extent, and that's not exactly the same, but Sherman gets word of Lincoln's assassination just after right before he meets with Johnston. And, this is tempering that conversation, is the background to that. And what happens with the dispersal of Johnston's army is very similar in many ways, and that's part of what Sherman gets in trouble for, of giving, he gets into political issues, which he's not allowed to do. But the one thing that is different is that contrary to what we might expect in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, Confederate soldiers are allowed, some of them are allowed to keep their rifles so that they can hunt on the way home. And so it actually is the opposite. That doesn't answer your counterfactual about how things look different. I think it looks different because I think Stanton is much more involved. And so Secretary of War, if Stanton has his finger on the pulse in a different way, because Lincoln had met with Grant and with Sherman in Farragut in late March aboard the River Queen, and he had laid out, you are only allowed to deal in the surrender of armies. You are only to deal with military issues. You can't touch political issues. You can't touch the readmission of states. You can't touch rights. You can't pardon. The parole at Appomattox is not a pardon. I think Lincoln had counseled Grant in a way. What would have been different would have been Stanton would have been irate, and that would have looked different. Yep. Yes.
As you said, Lincoln counseled Grant for this capitulation of his army. Were these paroles a part of that counseling, or are they something that Grant had to go and whip on the spot?
So, paroling is something that had happened well before Appomattox. Paroling, happened. Prisoners of war would be released from a place like Point Lookout, and they would be paroled. And the parole is not that different than the way we might think of a parole today. You're allowed to go home on good behavior, and then there's an exchange policy. This is one of the things that in the exchange of letters, if I'm getting too in the weeds, please ask me to clarify. But before the surrender even happens, Grant is right here in Farmville, and he gets the letter from Lee, and they're going back and forth talking about the terms. And one of the things that is left out when Grant goes to write down the terms is the notion that they will be until properly exchanged. And Lee pushes for that. I think it's hopeful thinking, hopeful wishing on Lee's part to say that, if this war continues and these men are sent home, if they're paroled, then there's a time at which they could be exchanged and they could be allowed to fight again. But otherwise, they're not supposed to pick up arms again. And now I've lost the thread of your question. Where did you start?
I'm guessing more or less the terms of the parole over the parole itself.
So the terms, Grant does come up with the terms there. He's coming up with the terms, though. Did I lose this? Who knows what I've done to any of this? So he will famously write in his memoir that when he put pen to paper, he didn't know what he was going to write. But he, in fact, did know what he was going to say. He had been told by Lincoln what to say. He had had this exchange of letters with Lee. So this is not new. But he does come up with the terms. And the one part of the term that he adds that is different than what he's done at Vicksburg, because remember, he's compelled an entire army to surrender, not once, not twice, but this is his third time. But the surrender at Vicksburg in the summer of 1963, those soldiers had been paroled as well. What he does say is that they will not be molested by U.S. authorities as long as they abide the laws in place. And this is seen as a blanket pardon. It's not a pardon. Only the executive can pardon. But this is how Confederate soldiers, including Lee, are reading the terms. And so Grant comes up with that on his own. But he also has a baseline from which, and he's got the president, it's the 3 Ps I use. He's got the president, he's got practice, and he's got pragmatism that he's relying on when he comes up with those. Yeah.
What was the percentage that Confederate Army received a parole pass? And if those who didn't, what were the reasons why?
You mean of Lee's army that's there? So everybody that's at Appomattox If you're at Appomattox, even if you have been a shirker off in the woods and you hear that dinner bell ring that night and you come back, you get a parole pass. Now, those passes, who went to Appomattox? Okay, you guys saw them. They cranked them out. They're big sheets of paper. They all get cut. Those blank passes go to regimental and brigade level officers. So they go to the Confederates. Those Confederate officers fill out that parole pass. Some of them, including men like Grimes, that are going to be marching to North Carolina, in order to keep control of their soldiers, they hang on to those parole passes. They don't hand them out at Appomattox. This is a way of leveraging some control. There are also examples that I found of men who get their hands on blank passes and forge identities. There's a senator from Texas, Wigfall, who wants to get back to Texas. And what does he do? He forges a pass, pretends to be a private in the Confederate Army to try to get back. So everyone that was there ostensibly gets a pass, and apparently then some. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm wondering if, in your research, if you had found anything as far as the Union side, like what the soldiers who were in the Confederate States when the surrender happened, what their experience was.
So say that one more time. So what Union soldiers that are in Confederate...
The reverse of what?
Oh, okay. So even thinking about the Union soldiers that are at Appomattox?
Yeah.
Great question. Thank you. So they're volunteer soldiers. They're citizen soldiers. They've signed up for the duration of the war. And even though I'm, on one hand, telling you that Appomattox is not the end, it is the formal end of the fighting for Lee's army. And every newspaper in the country, from New York to San Francisco, blazes headlines that say the war is over. And those Union soldiers in the field, they say yes. And their letters are all about how they want to go home. Our war's done. We will not be an army of occupation. We are citizen soldiers. It's not our duty to be an occupying force. So they are thrilled that they have saved the Union. They are thrilled that they have finally beaten the seemingly unbeatable Army of Northern Virginia, because except for Gettysburg, it's been a string of losses for the most part for the Army of the Potomac. And the Army of the James is there too. I don't want to slight them. But Union soldiers are ecstatic. They have won and they want to go home. And they become increasingly angry that they're not sent home right away. Some of those men that have been more recent recruits still have 2 and 3 years left on their service, especially those that had just come into the ranks that winter. And so there are many Union soldiers that are quite unhappy about that. But there's lots of stories of them celebrating. They start firing off artillery, and Grant will say, no, stop. These are our countrymen. We don't want to antagonize them anymore. But they are deliriously happy, and they're also ready to go home. Yeah.
I was also wondering if when the Union soldiers were traveling home, did they face
Okay. So the Union soldiers going home, there's a great book by Brian Matthew Jordan that talks about this, but it's a more formalized process. And let's say you're a group, let's say you're the 20th Maine. You've fought at Little Round Top with Chamberlain. You are here at Appomattox, or which direction? Whichever direction. That direction. Whichever way, you're at Appomattox. You are going to... you're actually going to make your way, let's see, they are at the Grand Review. In late May, they will participate in a Grand Review down Pennsylvania Avenue. And then they will take trains and make their way back to Maine, where they will formally be mustered out. So it is a much more formalized process. The government is paying for them to get, whether it's by train or by steamer or otherwise, much more formalized process. And they are taken care of as Union soldiers along the way.
Did they encounter were they treated differently when they returned home if they lived in the South prior to the war? Did they come in any confrontations?
I didn't cover that, but I'm sure that could have been the case. And that's certainly the case for those Confederate soldiers that are living in Union areas, even such as Alexandria. There's a good bit of animosity. It's not just their names published in newspapers. There's another man who was one of Mosby's Rangers, so he's a partisan ranger in the 43rd Virginia. He goes back to Fairfax, and he feels like he has to fly under the radar. He tries to open a school, and it gets all sorts of abuses for doing so, and feels like he has to leave the area. So going into any Unionist area could be a difficult proposition. Yep. One more question. Yes.
You partially answered this with Dr. Culver's hypothetical, and I apologize in advance for how brusque this is, but how does the rest of the Confederate Army surrenders compare to these Appomattox? I understand that Johnston and the Carolinas got a bit more of a harsher deal than Lee due to Lincoln's assassination. Also, how does it look in the West, like in Texas and Louisiana? Like, I understand they still had some pretty diehard holdouts until.
But there's so fewer troops. I mean, the two main armies are going to be Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. In the Army of Tennessee, I wouldn't say that the deal is harsher. I think Sherman gets his hand slapped because he tries to be too generous. And then Stanton tells Grant, you need to go take care of your boy Sherman and make sure he gives the exact same terms that were given at Appomattox. Then there are a handful of other provisions, such as carrying their weapons home. But they get the same terms. And across the board, they're all supposed to get the same terms as Lee's men get at Appomattox. Even though Stanton is questioning this, he asked the Attorney General to offer an opinion, to read Grant's terms and see if they should be legally binding. And the Attorney General has lots to say, but it's just an opinion. That too will get us in the weeds. But in the West, I mean, there's so many fewer soldiers. I won't go down to what Kirby Smith.
And Kirby Smith doesn't have nearly the level of control over what's left of his army that Grant there's a coup to remove him so he can't surrender. That ends up there's a coup against the coup, so it's kind of a mess.
It's a coup. Yeah. Thank you all very much. You've been a wonderful audience.